Hi there, and welcome to session 2 of our series on Mark's Gospel. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 23 to 45, in what I think is an absolutely fascinating passage that resonates a lot with some of the themes we saw in session 1. So keep your session 1 mind switched on, remind yourself of what we looked at there and some of the patterns and connections we saw, and hopefully you'll start to see even more as we look in session 2. So we have actually missed out a tiny little bit of the narrative. We're going to have to do that just by necessity as we go through. Don't forget those bits, they're equally important. So here we've missed out the bit where Jesus calls the first disciples. Keep that in mind as we're reading. That is the immediate context of the section that we're going to look at this morning. I also said in our introduction video and in the introduction notes to this series that one of the things that particularly interests me is making sure we don't just read one tiny segment at a time, because often Mark uses the connections between them to reveal who he believes Jesus to be. So today we're not actually even going to look at 2. If you take a look at today's section, if I were you, I would print off your text and mark it up. Put lines where you see it moving on, where you see a change in the story or a change in the character. Mine looks a little bit like this. Marked up, highlighted, circled where I'm seeing patterns. So according to my study, you may want to disagree with me, but according to what I see in the text, I see 5 different segments to this passage. The first one is Jesus begins his ministry in the synagogue and is confronted by a man with an evil spirit. The second is the healing of Simon's mother-in-law. The third is a session where the whole city comes to Jesus. So Jesus is surrounded by all of these people come from everywhere hearing about what he's been doing, even this early on in the gospel. That is followed by a tiny section where Jesus goes out with the disciples to the neighbouring villages and towns. And then this section is concluded with a healing of a leper. So let's look at those 5 together and see if there's any patterns or connections between them that can help us understand why Mark chose to tell them in this order, why Mark chose to connect them in the way he does, and what kind of larger points he's trying to make here. So I'm going to observe 4 different patterns that I see that are going to require us to know this text well, but also see what's come before. That's going to be another pattern of what we're going to do in this series. Is just because we've moved on from passages before doesn't mean we just dump them and forget about them. We want to keep those in mind as we're going. So number 1, and this is a great example of this, I've called letter A in your notes, voices. There's a pattern of different voices in Mark, particularly in this passage. In the opening 2 chapters, in the opening 2 chapters so far, we've seen, I don't mean the opening 2 chapters, I just mean the opening chapter. This is still in Mark 1, aren't we? I'm getting mixed up with session 2 and chapter 1. In the opening chapter of Mark, there are 3 voices who Mark has declared Jesus' identity, Jesus' character, Jesus' purpose, Jesus' mission. The first one is a voice from heaven. God's self declares Jesus' identity as God's son. An unclean spirit. So if you notice that the unclean spirit in verse 24 opens with, I know who you are the Holy One of God. That is almost echoing God's words from heaven, and that is scandalous on the lips of an unclean spirit. And then thirdly, the leper. So at the end of our passage, the is given voice. He is allowed to declare what Jesus has done, and that's really interesting. Think about what it means to be a witness to Christ. Often the disciples in the Gospel of Mark, to skip ahead a little bit, the pattern becomes they are the ones who struggle to bear witness to Christ, honestly. And sometimes it's the people on the edge, it's the people who we least expect it from, whose voices are used by Mark to declare the true nature of this Son of God. So keep in mind. A piece of evidence towards that is, think about Simon's mother-in-law. So we'll get to the movement of the passage in a minute. But Simon's mother-in-law, so Simon we assume was a Jew. And for the Jewish community, for the Jewish culture, ancient and modern, the woman is the social center of the community. So it's a matriarchal society. So if you think about it, Simon's mother-in-law, so Simon's wife's mother, was the matriarch of the matriarchs. She was the social center of the community. And so she, probably of all the people who would have been the first to have an opinion, whose voice would have been heard the most in that family, has no voice in this passage. Does she say anything? She doesn't get a word. She simply gets up and serves. Now, I don't think that's because Mark was being misogynist here. I don't think he's trying to silence the women in this passage, because later we get women, and we're going to see, particularly in session 7, how women's voices are so key in the Gospel of Mark. I think it's because, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but that doesn't matter, that Simon's mother-in-law represents Israel here, I think. And Israel's job was to serve God. And notice what she does upon being healed. Simon's mother, she was in bed with a fever, and they told him once about her. He came, took her by the hand, and lifted her up. The fever left her, and she began to serve them. I don't think that's because women were domestic servants. I think that's because, in this case, this woman represents Israel, and Israel's job was to serve God. So once healed, she was able to do that which she was designed to do. It's not to do with her gender. It's not to do with, it's to do with the fact that she represents the bigger picture of who Israel was and who Israel was called to be. So that's voices. Knowledge, similar pattern with the word knowledge. Interesting that the word know comes up in verse 22 and 23 here. Really important to recognize who knows who Jesus is here and who doesn't know. Who does Jesus want to know and who doesn't Jesus want to know? I'll leave that with you to ponder as you look at the text and as you discuss. Again, touch. Now, and this touch point leads me into my last point about what's the overall point here? Why do we get these stories all together? Well, I think we've got a similar pattern to what we see in session 1. So in session 1, we looked at how Jesus began in the wilderness, traced the path of Israel into the promised land via the Jordan, and then back into the wilderness, back into exile with his people. Here, the pattern moves. So Jesus moves into the synagogue. But interestingly, the synagogue situation is interrupted by an unclean spirit who does not belong in the synagogue. At the religious center of Judaism was not associated with that which is unclean. Obviously, that was kept out. And so Jesus then, the situation moves from the center of the religious world to the center of the social world, really. So back to Simon's mother-in-law. So Jesus goes from healing an unclean spirit in the synagogue, who seemingly seems to know who he is when nobody else really knows what's going on, goes right to the heart and heals Simon's mother-in-law, to the symbolic heart of Judaism. He then goes to the whole city. So from the Jews, interestingly, it spreads out to cover many different places, and out further, if you like, from the whole city to neighboring cities. And then interestingly, the story seems to culminate in a leper. So we've gone from outside inside, so the outside voice speaking from the center of the synagogue. I don't quite know what you do with that. I'd be interested to hear. And then we go out, whole city, neighboring cities, and then we come right back in again. But what we come back into is not Judaism this time. It's to the outside voice, to the leper, to the voice whose bodily condition meant that he was unfit to participate in community life. Something about his physical condition stopped him from participating in the people of God. And that's where Jesus ends. And that's who Jesus seemingly, let me rephrase that. That's who Mark gives the last word to in this passage. Because Jesus actually tells him not to say anything. And he doesn't seem to follow that very, very well. But that's another question for another day. So I've got here, the overall movement of the passage is Jesus' ministry begins in the religious centre, moves to the social centre of the community. Then he becomes the centre of attention. So we get to a point where everyone's looking at Jesus, and he quickly deflects that, and we end up at the social extremities of our society. Okay, a lot more to say there. Please look in the connect points. Look at my point in the I've called further for this one. There's a really interesting translation issue further down in the passage. Would be interested to hear what you've got to say about that. But for now, that is session 2. Hope you enjoy it.